Good morning. Well, I think we're organised. I've spent a little bit of time getting set up, and we've been playing with Zoom connections and that sort of thing. And there was a bit of concern about whether maybe we were an hour out from our planned get together, but I think we've finally made it. So I'm here. It's actually weekend. It's what time is it now? It's coming up to 9:15 UK time. I'm really pleased to have Vanessa Beeley with me. And Vanessa's been kind enough to say that she'd join me for an hour's chat. And of course, I've invited her to speak to me because I absolutely put Vanessa Beeley in the gutsy woman category. And Vanessa, thank you very much for taking the time to join me today, because I know you've got some really important other personal stuff to do. So thank you.
No, I know you're welcome, Brian. It's always a pleasure talking to you anyway.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, the aim of this is that I've recognised for quite some time that where are the men? I'm allowed to say this. I'm not a particularly big bloke, but I feel I've put my head above the parapet over quite a few years. I've experienced some interesting things when I've tried to stand up and tell the truth and support people. I've had the police at my house several times. In fact, in my house, which was an interesting experience. It refocuses your view of how the world works in your own country, at least. But I've just, felt sometimes, where are the men? And the other thing is that from the earliest days in the UK column, it was women that were coming forward, certainly to support me and bring the UK column into being. So I've got a lot of time for the gutsy women, and I thought I'd get you to. I'm going to laugh now. I thought I'd get you to come and talk to me, and tell the audience in the beginning a little bit about yourself. So it's up to you. What you want to share with us. It's your life. But first question, Vanessa, is how did you get started with doing this? You're now operating as an independent journalist. You've put yourself in some pretty dangerous positions in reporting from troubled spots around the world. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got on this journey.
Oh gosh, I always find it quite difficult talking about myself anyway. Not because of a confidentiality issue, but just I don't know. I think as journalists, you're used to transmitting the voices of others and keeping your voice silent, and I think it's then quite difficult to bring yourself out into the open. I guess really, as I've said a few times before, it probably started as a kid. I mean, I grew up with a dad who was um, known as being one of the most iconic Arabists of his time, described as such even by Peter Ford, the former UK ambassador to Syria in 2003 to 6. So I grew up in a household, although I wasn't, tuning into it maybe, except on a subliminal basis and by osmosis, I absorbed this knowledge of the Middle East, the situation with Palestine. My father, of course, was a lifelong advocate for Palestinian justice and the end of the Zionist colonialist occupation. And as I said, even though I probably, I wasn't politically active during the years that he was alive, I led a relatively normal life. I did study journalism as a teenager because I decided I always loved writing. And then I actually lost three obviously very close family members. My brother-in-law in '99, my mother in 2000, and my dad in 2001. And I think that was a massive traumatizing. My brother-in-law was actually murdered. My mother died from a protracted cancer, suffering from various forms of cancer. And my dad was 92, had multiple strokes. So it was a very, as I said, tumultuous time. And I think when my father died, I decided that rather than keep working in the corporate world where I was, I needed to make some changes.
What I wanted to say to you is just to set the scene. Um, did your early life start overseas, or did you spend some time in UK? Just
No, I was born in Tavistock in Devon, which you probably know.
I
And
didn't
then
actually. That's very
yeah.
interesting. You kept that one very quiet.
And then my father at the time was stationed in Geneva. So at 2 months old, I was basically uprooted from the UK and taken to Geneva. He was then sent to, or he was requested actually by President Nasser in 1967. So I was 3 years old then, to come back to Cairo as the peace envoy after the Six-Day War, when, of course, Egypt had effectively been betrayed by Britain, France, Israel. And so my dad was sent as a special peace envoy, come ambassador, to Cairo in 67, and I went with him as a 3-year-old. But I have actually, strangely, very vivid memories of the embassy in Cairo, of life in Cairo. I loved it. I mean, even as a kid, I was very comfortable in that environment. In fact, my mother told me I was constantly running away from my nanny and could be found in the mosque or in, in somewhere that I really wasn't supposed to be and would be brought back home.
Well, there we are. The audience won't know, but in a few minutes we had a little bit of fun with connections, and Vanessa hasn't got electricity where she is at the moment, so we've had to revert to alternative means to speak. So well done, the fun. All right. Well, Vanessa, you were saying that when you were in Cairo with your father and the family, you were very taken by life, and you would escape from your, did you say nanny? I think so. Uh,
Yes.
and will be found in various places, including the mosque. So you moved from Tavistock, you ended up right the way around the
Geneva.
world. And
Yeah, pretty much as a kid. And then my dad retired actually in 69. I mean, he was 55 when I was born. I don't think I was very expected. It was basically both my parents' second marriage. They both had children from the first marriage. But yeah, so he was 55 when I was born. He retired in 69. And so then we came back to London, basically.
okay. And so what were you doing then? I'm not going to I know you're giving us dates, but I'm not going to put two and two together and work out your age
Well, it's
exactly.
relatively easy.
Okay, so you came back to London, and then what were you doing?
Oh, well, I mean, then I was just, going going through the whole school process, work process, etc. I mean, that part of my life I don't think has any huge relevance to what I'm doing now, except for the fact that, of course, as I said, my father's work continued long after his retirement. I mean, I think it was in 76 he opened the World of Islam Trust in London to try and, I guess, bridge the lack of appreciation of Islamic culture and art and history, heritage, and so on. And as I said, he continued on this track very much. I mean, my mother also having obviously also herself retired to some degree, but then she started her own business for clothing from the Middle East, which she established with a partner. God, I think sometime in the 80s. I can't remember exact dates. I'm hopeless on that kind of thing. And so, both of them continued very much along the same track. So I guess even as a teenager, as a young adult, I was still very much absorbing the Middle Eastern culture. But I think what happened for me after the various losses that I had, particularly after my father died in 2001, and I inherited or ended up with all of his confidential papers and diaries and so on. And my father was not a very, he was rather Victorian. Children should be seen and not heard. He had a huge intellect. I mean, he came from working class background, socialist background, from North Lancashire. But as an only child, he achieved scholarships into almost every school and university that he went to. And he actually trained as he went to Oxford University to train as a Methodist priest, and then basically uh, I don't quite know what happened, but in the meantime he became atheist and then flipped over to the Foreign Office, and he was in fact one of the youngest ever ambassadors to be appointed from within the Foreign Office.
Right.
But he was a bit of an enigma as a father. I mean, we weren't particularly close because emotionally he was rather closed off. His work was his world. His work was his passion, and really, in some ways, the family was rather secondary to that. Particularly children, we would just, I was just probably quite annoying from his perspective. But I think after he died in 2001, I actually sadly got to know him much, much better than I had in life through reading his diaries and discovering this kind of wellspring of emotion and passion, particularly for my mother, but also for the Middle East, for the cause, I guess, that he fought for, which again, as I've said, was for, preventing the settlement of European immigrants into Palestine and the theft of land by the Zionist project. So yeah, I guess that's what kind of then set me off on the next part of my journey.
Okay, so what was the actual trigger then that took you into what, well, let's call it journalism. What happened, and what was the first thing you sort of got involved in, which meant that you were speaking out?
I think I'd always been, some people, and I probably shouldn't say that, but I was always described as a mouthy so-and-so. I won't say the second word. I was always in trouble at school. I was always in trouble at work because I would always defend the underdog. I was forever getting into hot water with my various bosses and headmasters and so on. And at one point at my final school, myself and my best friend actually had a weekly meeting with the headmistress because, as she said, well, you're bound to have done something in the week in between. So, so I don't know. I always had a penchant for trouble anyway, regardless of whether it was at that point in the work I do now or not. And I think how I got into it initially was through activism. And I think a lot, I know that Eva Bartlett, dear friend of mine that hopefully you'll be talking to, her path into it was very much through the same way. And so after my dad died, the first thing that I wanted to do, because really Egypt for him held such a special place in his heart, and equally he held a special place in the heart of Egypt because of his role as very much a supporter of Egypt, particularly against the British government. I wanted to go because there had been trees planted for him in the gardens of one of the museums, one of his favorite museums in Cairo. But how it happened really was I thought, well, I'm going to Cairo. I might as well try to go to Gaza and actually, discover for myself. So I was given an invitation by an orphanage in the Al Amal Institute in Gaza to come and teach English for 2 weeks to kids, orphans of all ages. in Gaza. So basically, that was where it all started. I went to Cairo, which was a very odd. In fact, one of the strangest things, and I haven't really talked about this ever, but I remember being back on the streets of Cairo and remembering it quite vividly. And I was crossing a road, and this elderly man came up to me, and he basically said to me, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, and I gave him my first name, and he said, "You remind me of someone." And we started this whole conversation, and it turned out he knew my father. So this was literally in the first 2 days of being back in Cairo for the first time since '69. And I revisited the embassy, very nice ambassador, actually, very pro-Palestine. I wrote to them and they invited me back to the embassy, which hadn't changed at all. And then basically I got all the permissions I needed to go to Gaza. And then it was a series of disasters because people may not realize the Rafah crossing, which is in the Sinai Desert near to Al Arish, even though it's officially on Egyptian territory, it's very much controlled by the Zionists. So despite having all the paperwork and despite queuing for hours with thousands of Palestinians trying to get through these tiny gates that they open up, it's a continuous humiliation process, by the way, of Palestinians, whether it's from Egypt or from the Zionists or from the Jordanians, it doesn't matter. We were basically spun. And so this went on. This is where I actually met Eva Bartlett, by the way, was at the Rafah crossing in July 2012. She got in because she'd been basically living there for some time. And I think it was the third attempt, I entered Gaza by the tunnels. So that was in November 2012. And then 3 days after I entered, the Israeli aggression of 2012 began. So having entered the tunnels, therefore having no official visa through Egypt, I had no exit route either. Not that I would have left in any case, because of course I would stay in solidarity with the Palestinian people. It's not, I would consider it an injustice if me as a Westerner, I can just walk back out and leave them to the bombs when they don't have that same privilege.
Vanessa, if I can just come in there, because the what we're doing is about gutsy women, and I'm going to say straight away, I can imagine that actually to go into Gaza via those tunnels, when you're not fully what's the word? You haven't got all the permissions. That takes some guts to do. So straight away, you've told me some things. You've said, well, at school I was a bit of a rebel, and makes me smile because the other women I've talked to, who are the ones speaking up and standing up to be counted, they've all got something in their backgrounds, which is that they didn't sort of take the establishment lightly. So you've clearly got those attributes, but you're telling us straight away that one of the first things you did is to go into Gaza through the tunnels, and yeah, that must have taken some courage to do. I don't know how you felt at the time.
Well, I'm quite claustrophobic. I think probably one of my biggest phobias is being trapped, particularly underground. So it was myself and another colleague who he was going to be coming and working with me in the orphanage. So at that time, I wasn't even a journalist, so I wasn't really used to this kind of thing at all. But I decided, well, I'm here, and the tunnels were not actually that bad. I mean, you could stand up inside of them. They were very well shored up. There was some lighting. And then when you reach the end, there's a little kind of pulley lift that brings you up into daylight, so to speak. And then we were just straight in a taxi and driving through the streets of Gaza from the south, so from Rafah through Khan Yunis, up to Gaza City to the Corniche, which is the area on the sea front. And in fact, very sadly, one of the hotels that really we all used to frequent when we'd finished working and so on, and just sit and drink watermelon juice and look at the amazing sunsets and so on, has been bombed into oblivion by the recent Zionist ethnic cleansing program again, you know. So again, a lot of what I lived through in Gaza, the people and so on, I don't even know if they're alive now. I managed to get through to one person yesterday for the first time in, what is it now, almost 70 days. And he's basically been displaced 2 or 3 times. He's seen horrific things. I mean, in 2012, you know, there were some very horrific things going on, but nothing like now. And Eva will say the same thing. She was there in 2008-9 also. But as she says, both of these, or all three of the what they call euphemistically mowing the lawn. So in 2008-9, 2012, 2014, nothing compares to what is going on now.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine it. So, you know, that was my first experience really. And as I said, within 2 days, we had gone to Khan Yunis, and literally right in front of us, a 13-year-old boy, Hamid Abu Daga, was mown down by a Apache helicopter while he was playing football outside his house. And this is in peacetime. And Israeli tanks had entered Gazan territory also within Khan Yunis. And so that was a very sort of, I guess, you know, a very fast introduction to what my life would be like for the next 10, 12 years. Because almost immediately we were involved in speaking to the family, in filming and in, you know, just recording
So
witness
Vanessa,
statements and so on. Yeah.
Vanessa, is it fair to say, therefore, that it was your connection with Eva that drew you into the reporting side?
No, not really. At that point, I didn't know Eva. You know, I'd met her at the Rafah border, but then our paths didn't really cross. She was there in 2012, but we were staying in different areas. I didn't see her. And in fact, I didn't see her again. We bumped into each other serendipitously in Cairo in 2013 when I was waiting to go back to Gaza. And then we didn't really, we stayed in touch. By then I was already writing and photographing. And in fact, in Gaza is where I learned photography. I've never learned it professionally, but I just discovered that I had a good eye, and I wasn't bad at it. So I just developed it from there, but it began inside Gaza.
Right. So what would you consider your first report from Gaza? And what form
I
did...
think it's the first report on my blog, The Wall Will Fall. And I think it was about, again, prisoners being stripped naked and being taken out of the strip to an unknown destination. And in fact, from memory, the majority of them were never returned. So I think that was the first time that I actually wrote about something that was, you know, something factual. I wrote about my experiences. I mean, I do remember the Israelis would generally, the worst bombing was at night. Then it was just like a bombing frenzy, because you would have it from the sea, you would have it from tanks, from Apache helicopters, from warplanes, from drones. I mean, walking in the street was high risk. And I remember one night it'd been particularly intensive bombing campaign, and they were using heavy duty I mean, really heavy duty bombs, concussion bombs, bunker buster bombs, and so on. And usually around 5 a.m., the planes would leave to go and refuel, and there would be a sort of a temporary lull. And I remember at this time being out on, I think it was on the roof of our building, and it went quiet. And suddenly the azan, the prayer from all the mosques, it began in one mosque, and then it spread from one mosque to the other mosque to the other mosque to the other mosque. And it was the most eerie sound, and yet the most uplifting sound. It was almost a sound of defiance, that even after all of this bombing, with the sun rising, the prayer just echoed out across the sea in front of us in this weird calm. And that's something that has always stayed with me. And it's always demonstrated to me this defiance of a belief in all the things that Palestinians believe in. And one of the things that I guess I took away from my time in Gaza then was this lack of hate within Palestinian hearts. It didn't exist. Even the parents and the family of the 13-year-old boy that was just shot in front of them for no reason. He was playing football. I didn't once hear them condemn Israel. All I heard was confusion. Like, don't these pilots have children? How can they kill a child? How can they take someone's son like this? And this was really universal in Gaza. There was no hate. There was just a belief in justice, a belief in their ultimate freedom from the horrors that they were being forced to live through, basically in what is a concentration camp, a prison, completely enclosed on all sides, even on the beach side, because Israel patrols the waters. The fishermen are fired on a daily basis from 6 a.m. in the morning onwards. And to find this incredible humanity in this bomb-strewn, dusty, litter-covered, sprawling environment, constantly under attack, constantly under siege, constantly under pressure. Even in peacetime, the planes would fly through at a speed that would create sonic booms that sound like a bomb being dropped. So these people never had any respite. They never have any respite. I mean, if we look at what's happening now, but even then, there was no respite ever. And yet they could still laugh. I remember, even during the aggression, there was still a wedding on Saturday. On one Saturday, there was still a wedding in the morning. And there was still dancing. And there were still people trying to enjoy themselves amongst all of the carnage, all of the hideous environment that they're forced to live in.
Yeah. Vanessa, you've talked about taking photographs. You talked about writing about what's happening. What was the reaction that you got when you started to put out that information?
Well, I think back then it was very muted because people didn't really know me. I think really it only became an issue when Eva and I started reporting on Syria. And I was going to say, when I got back in touch with Eva in 2013, she'd already established the Syria Solidarity Movement as it was then. And she asked me to join. I mean, the other thing, just to point out, I left Gaza in 2000, I was there in 2012. I went back in 2013 to establish a project for the orphans and the kids that were suffering with ADHD to try and use nature, particularly horses, because there were 2 equestrian centers in Gaza, to introduce the kids to horses, to animals, to nature, to try and help with their trauma through these ways. And so I was actually negotiating residency in Gaza when I was diagnosed with cancer. In Gaza, I think I must be the only Westerner to have been diagnosed in Gaza. So at that point, I had to come back to France for about a year's cancer treatment, but I was still in touch with Eva. And as I said, that's when I started to get interested in what was going on in Syria, because it was very obvious to me that, it wasn't all as it appeared. And so I guess when I was writing from inside Gaza, I mean, I do remember, I think my first ever interview, and I mean, looking back on it, it's funny in a way, but at the time it was quite terrifying also, was that I was asked on, I can't remember which channel it was, and it was at night. And of course, at night, the Israelis bombing was intensified. And it was in the Sharuk Tower, which was the main media tower on the 8th floor, which had been bombed 2 days before, and 3 or 4 journalists had been killed there. And the car came to get me, and basically we were driving like Schumacher through the streets, because at any point, the drone could release a missile, the planes, anyone, because anyone was a target. If you were moving in the streets, you were a target. Didn't matter if you were an ambulance, a press car, or whatever. He had a press card in the front window, but I knew full well it wouldn't mean anything. So he basically sort of screamed to a halt in front of the Sharuk Tower, and he said to me, "It's on the 8th floor." He literally bundled me out of the car. And of course, there were no lifts, because everything had been bombed, all the electricity was out, and so on. As I entered the building and went up all the flights of stairs, someone came down to meet me. There was still blood on the floor from the journalist that had been killed a few or a couple of days before. And I remember entering the studio. This was literally the first time I'd ever done an interview of any kind. And they sat me with my back to a massive window. And in fact, which was open, the only thing I was scared of was falling from the 8th floor. And then I remember turning around and seeing an Apache helicopter hovering, like literally only a few meters away from the open window. And I thought, okay, at this point, you sort of go into a suspended animation. You stop worrying, you stop being nervous or afraid. You just deal with it, because there's nothing else you can do. And then the slightly comical moment was when the cameraman who was in the room with me received a call, and he was smiling when he said it to me. He said, "They're going to be 10 minutes late." And I mean, people will find it strange that we're laughing, but I think maybe you can understand this, Brian. When you're in a war situation, actually the sense of humor is heightened, because humor is a way that people deal with any hideousness in their life, and Palestinians are no different, Syrians are no different. Sometimes people kind of say to me, my goodness, that when I post certain things that are funny to me or are funny to Syrians, despite the hardship they're going through, people don't understand it. But actually, when you're in that environment, I mean, I remember when the drones were particularly heavy, we would all send each other messages saying, well, the drone party's here tonight. And then it would move, of course, to another area. So then, and so this sense of humor is what gets people through. Even when I was speaking to my friend in Khan Yunis yesterday, and he was sending me recordings of the tanks and the gunfire and the warplanes. And then he just started laughing. He said, "Isn't this ridiculous? Like, we're having a perfectly normal conversation and all of this is going on around me. And at any minute, I might get wiped out, but we're just talking like it's a normal environment." Being in war is a very difficult thing for people to understand. And that's actually one reason I live in Syria, because here people understand me. in the West, people don't understand that intensity. They don't understand that when you've been exposed to the inhumanity of humanity, it's very difficult to go back to a kind of a normal, whatever normal is, a normal environment where you're not with people that understand it. It's very difficult.
Vanessa, really, that was a really interesting account of the environment and how you reacted with that environment and how other people did. And I think you made some really excellent points that people who are in very high stress situations have to do something to get through that. I want to say straight away that although I spent time in the military, I have to count myself very lucky because I was never near, or let's say I was never in a conflict zone. And for me, probably the closest I got to that was the Falklands War when the particular ship I was on board, we actually got down there. I think it was a day or a day after the armistice was signed. So the fighting had all stopped the day we arrived. But nevertheless, when we were preparing to go down and the fighting was going on, yeah, there was absolute tension. But I want to say that because I'm very conscious that military people out there who've been through conflict zones wherever it has been, whether it's been in Iraq or Afghanistan, if we're talking about British military people, I can't compete with that sort of experience. And I think it's only fair that I should say and declare that to the audience. But I'm going to say, do I understand what you're talking about? I think I do, yeah. Vanessa, so I'll just keep pushing on the bit of you becoming a journalist. You've experienced this all firsthand, and of course, this makes a huge difference. You're not a person who's safe at home commenting on what's happening in the Middle East. You've been there, you've lived through the violence. So you've got firsthand knowledge, which is invaluable. What about a public talk? Well, sorry, you've described going and giving that interview at the radio station. When did you do your first big public talk? Because I remember you telling me some time ago that actually you found public talking quite difficult.
Yeah, I always did, even at work, when I used to have to give presentations. I remember one particularly important one. I couldn't take my finger off the mouse because if I did, my hand was shaking so much I'd never have got my finger back on the mouse again. For me, it's actually easier to kind of be on the ground than it is to speak publicly. Of course, now I've done enough of it that I'm relatively good with it, not good. I don't consider myself good, but I mean, I'm relatively relaxed with it now. Certainly nothing compared to what I was. I'm just desperately trying to think when the first time was that I did any public speaking. I mean, I didn't come to Syria until 2016. I tried in 2015, but didn't get through because of visas and so on. I would guess it was probably after 2016 that I started really gathering traction, because at that point there weren't very many people on the ground in Syria reporting a different narrative to the Western media, of course. There was Eva Sharmin Nawani, who had actually been covering the conflict fantastically well since 2012. I mean, she's based in Lebanon. There was a couple of other people, but really that was about it. And then I started in 2016. And of course, at that point, we were coming up to the liberation of Aleppo in December 2016. So I would say that was my first really, really serious reporting, was in Aleppo, December 2016, when I was following the Syrian army as they were liberating each district of East Aleppo. And at that point, I think, and I'm trying to think, I think in early 2016, I'd written the first of the White Helmet exposés. And that is what that kind of catapulted me into this maelstrom of media criticism and so on. So from, I think it was August 2016 onwards, really.
Right. And I'm embarrassed to ask you this question because I should know it. But when did you get involved with the UK column? When
Oh goodness,
was
I think that was also it was 2016, because if I wrote the two first White Helmet articles, which were the first in a very long archive now. And then I think it was around September 2016 that I came onto UK column, because I remember reporting for UK column, or with UK column, from Aleppo in December. So it must have been in that interim period between August and December.
Yeah, and my goodness, I mean, you've taught us so much because a lot of your reports have been the key reports that got us. Well, I'm going to say me. Mike has always been particularly interested in things to do with the Middle East, but your reports got me thinking about what we in the UK, with the legacy media, I have to call it now, the mainstream media, most people will still respond to, but that narrative so strong about what was happening in the world. I mean, I started to particularly question things around reports of the wars in Iraq. I was still in the Navy when the first attacks went in, and first of the Western attacks went in, and I remember at the time feeling uncomfortable that there was something going on I couldn't quite put my finger on, and from that time onwards, I was questioning things, and your very personal reports were adding to that. And of course, now I'm going to say in 2023, it's very easy for me to look at the world and say, my goodness, we've just been living a life full of propaganda from the West on so many issues, but much of it a complete pack of lies about how conflicts have started around the world and who the good guys are and who the bad guys. So I'll just throw that little one in there, but it was really excellent when you started to report with us, and I'm going to say we've had a lot of fun. I remember at one stage you came over and you were going to do a talk at Stop the War Coalition, and at short notice I was tasked to be your driver, and I remember
Oh God.
do you remember that on a fairly dark and stormy night? I missed the turning, and we had a little bit of a fraught journey to get you
Yes, I
living there.
definitely remember that.
But the bit that went with it, which I think we should share with the audience, is that when we then came to come home, there was a road closure, and we ended up doing a detour through some of the narrowest, darkest, wiggliest Dartmoor
Yes,
lanes.
I do remember that. That
Yeah,
was that was quite an adventure.
but
I mean,
we
to a degree, it's all been. Gosh, I don't know. Sometimes when you look back over it, we're so kind of caught up in the here and now, and what's happening now. You kind of, it's not you forget, but you don't dwell in the past. When you suddenly start going over it again, there's a huge number of experiences, some good, some bad. I mean, some of the adventures getting to Gaza or getting to Rafah through El Arish and so on were fairly horrific, actually. I mean, I'm very lucky that I have a very strong intuition, and I'm very lucky again that I listen to it because a lot of people have it, but they don't listen to it. They override it with intellect or emotion. Whereas for me, the minute that my intuition kicks in, I act on it. And that's often why I actually like working alone in the field, because then I'm entirely reliant on me. I'm not being overridden by somebody else's agenda or whatever. And I have to say that did literally save my life on a number of occasions. So it's something that I'm very blessed to have.
Well, it's a very good point. A very good point, Vanessa. And perhaps my response would be that over the years, I've dealt with a lot of people who've been in very bad positions, crises, as a
Mm,
result of, well, I'm going to go to the subject, which is that they've had their children taken away from them.
mm,
And in their very distraught state of mind as a result of that loss and fighting for justice, one of the things I always say to them, and it's often, of course, a mother that I'm dealing with, I always say, trust your instinct. Because
mm,
if you stop trusting your own instinct, in my view, you're lost. That's the thing that
mm.
comes first. Because in a survival situation, that's all you've got is to trust your own instinct. So I think you're identifying something which is very important. And
Yeah.
I can understand what you're saying. If you have somebody else there with you who perhaps is not as strong as you are, their uncertainty can then impact on you.
Mm.
That's an amazing point.
Yeah,
Vanessa, I've got to
definitely.
ask this question because we're here. You're a gutsy woman, and I know from
Yeah.
what you've told me, shared with the audience today, that you've been through some really tough stuff and you've seen some really unpleasant things. But for other women out there, what would you say to them to get other women to stand up and fight? What would it be? Wrongdoing, injustice. What would you say to them to get them doing things instead of just watching?
I'd be quite surprised if women generally are just watching, because I think we are naturally. It's kind of our DNA to be the nurturers and the carers and the protectors. Um, and I guess what is really important is the need for that feminine energy. In any situation, even in Gaza, women have an innate ability to be able to empathize. I'm not saying that men don't have it, but women have it without even sort of acknowledging it. And therefore, that kind of energy, I think, is incredibly necessary now that we're living in a world it's a grinding world. If we're not talking about war, we're talking about oppression. If we're not talking about oppression, we're talking about poverty. We're talking, predator class theft. Everywhere we look, we're looking at a very kind of patriarchal energy that is feeding on humanity. I can't describe it any other way. And so, therefore, in my view, and I'm not in any way denigrating masculine energy, but I'm just saying right now, the need is for feminine nurturing energy, and for feminine feminine touch. I don't want to belittle it either, but it really is something that I can't even really define. Um, and it's very necessary now. And so, therefore, I think I would have to say, I would guess, I mean, for me, I can't speak for Eva. It'd be interesting to see if you ask her the same question. But if I speak for myself, my work comes from a desire to nurture and to give voices and to end the silence for many people. So I hope it comes from a place of compassion, first and foremost.
So you
It's
would,
not, it's not a career for me. Uh, it's something that I couldn't imagine me doing anything else right now. My conscience wouldn't allow me to go off and do something else right now. And so therefore, I think for women, I think it's important to understand that your voice counts, that your voice is necessary, and that your input is necessary because people need you.
yeah. Thank you for that, Vanessa. And the bit that goes with this, of course, is for me to say to you, and what would you say to the men? And I ask this question because I I I know that there are a lot of men out there that are standing up and they're trying to do the right thing. But I'm also seeing so many men who even people I'm not a big bloke. I always say this. I'm not a big bloke, but I've got my head firmly above the parapet and I have had it above the parapet for many years. And I see many tough guys out there who hide in the shadows. They won't even put uh, their face on social media. They comment from the shadows, and I'm astonished
Mm.
at what I regard as well. Actually, it's cowardice when I come to it. People who know something's wrong, men who know something wrong, and they are not, as far as I'm concerned, doing their job, which is by by virtue of the fact they're a man, they should have the guts to be able to stand up and call out the wrongdoing. But a lot of them seem to be hiding, and I find it astonishing. I think I've said it in one of the other interviews that I've done of this series, that if you want to meet a coward, meet a senior retired British military officer, because this is how I've found them over the years. They won't engage with the topic, and what are they really frightened
But
of?
is that because of a kind of institutionalization?
Part
They don't want to, I guess, break out of the establishment. I'm guessing.
I
Um,
think that's absolutely it.
mm,
They've believed their whole, when they get very senior, they've gone through a system where they could only become senior by very often being a yes man to what's being asked of them, what's taking place around them. They then move up the ladder, maybe with a bit increase in age and an increase in experience. They begin to understand that actually things weren't quite how they thought. But then what are they? They've become a sir, for example. They've had the knighthood, but they
mm.
might just be a senior retired military officer. I think what they're really scared of is their reputation at the golf club. If 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 the, if the circle of friends around them
Oh
feel
God.
that they are,
Well, it's peer pressure then, isn't it?
peer
I
pressure.
guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, I
So
mean, my father, for example, was a sir. I mean, one quite funny story. I think you know that you're supposed to back out in front of the Queen. My mother refused. She turned around and walked out frontwards and caused quite a scandal at the time. But but that didn't stop him speaking out, and that didn't stop him still creating waves long after.
yeah,
So I think, oh gosh, I mean, I think that applies to everyone. This whole peer pressure, because that's what gaslighting is, isn't it? It's creating a fear or an environment in which you're afraid to speak out because you'll be mocked by your peers, or you'll be. But I kind of think that um, one of my heroes is Dag Hammarskjöld, the first Secretary General of the UN, who was assassinated in 1961 on a peace mission to Congo, and was actually my father's mentor largely. And he always said, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the exact quote, you don't choose the way chooses you. And once you're on the way, your conscience does not allow you to deviate. And I think that's always been my mantra, you know, even when sometimes everyone has a wobble, everyone thinks, oh God, do I really want to do this? Because it's just going to bring the sky down on my head again, you know. But then tune into your conscience. And if your conscience is saying you have to do it, you can't remain silent, then you take the consequences. And I think this is the thing. I think people have been gaslighted to the extent where they no longer listen to that inner voice. They no longer listen to their conscience. They no longer give their conscience the importance it deserves. And they don't empower their own conscience. And I think that would be a message that I would give to everyone, you know, male or female. Sorry, the puppy just woke up. That would be the message.
Well, that makes complete sense, and I can certainly understand this because I've been on a journey myself and often felt that my life was on rails, taking me in a particular direction, and I certainly had to get over this. Yeah, it is concern. Some people would call it fear. I felt fear, but I did feel concern. You know, you put your head up, you start speaking, the flack comes in, and all of a sudden your life's changed, and actually you
Yeah,
can't go back. That's the thing about it.
yeah.
I want to, Vanessa, I want to end with a question for you. You talked about the instinct of the woman, and you covered that a few minutes ago. If I could put you in a room full of Israeli women, what would you say to them?
Why? Why? Um, what makes your children more valuable than the children of Palestinians?
Yeah, that's a very simple question. I have a feeling that if you ever had the opportunity to be in that position and you asked that question, it would prompt quite some quite some debate. And I think, and this is just me letting my imagination go, I think initially there would be silence, and then probably there would be some uh, heated words and aggression. And then I think if the women in the room were able to continue talking to each other, it would slowly but surely come back to reality and compassion. And I think you'd achieve something positive out of it. Um, One of the reasons I say that is because I believe that when you get ordinary people together, they may initially have very different views and they might be quite antagonistic to each other. But ordinary people seem to have a way of grounding things out. And I believe that much of the problem in the world today is by people we might call politicians, but clearly people who have vested interests. And also, they don't have many of the, or they're lacking many of the basic human traits of love and compassion for their own political agenda. And it's largely their influence that colours the views of ordinary people.
Mm. Yeah, there
Vanessa?
was actually sorry, just very quickly, there was rather a sad story actually in the last 2 days. There was a former IDF soldier who had joined Breaking the Silence, which is the group that exposes the crimes of its actual former IDF soldiers, exposing the crimes of IDF soldiers. But he had developed a friendship with a young academic inside Gaza that had lasted for years, you know, talking about peace and talking about solutions and so on. And 3 days ago, that friend was killed by an Israeli bomb. And that for me was kind of symbolic of what you're talking about, you know.
Yeah. Vanessa, I think we got to a natural end.
Yep.
I'm going to say to you, thank you so much because you've taken us on a really interesting journey through elements of your life and what you've come in contact with. But ultimately, I've got to end by saying, uh, if you were called a bit feisty at school, it's done you good because you've ended up a gutsy woman. And without having the guts to get in these sorts of environments that you've been in, you would have never have been able to have given the reports that you have. So I'm going to say to you, well done. And I hope that your actions will be an inspiration to other women and certainly other men. Come on, blokes, if you're listening to this. And we need more people to be lifting the stones and reporting, what's really taking place. So I'd like to end there by saying, Vanessa, thank you very much for doing this. And I'm sure the audience are going to find it extremely interesting.
Oh, thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me on. I certainly spoke about more of me than I would do ever normally, but I hope people find it interesting.
Yeah, brilliant. And this is going out over the Christmas period. So we hope that that's a time when people, at least in this country, are going to be having a little bit of a quieter time and a little bit of reflection. So maybe they've got a bit of time in their thoughts and their hearts for the suffering that's going on in the Middle East, and that may change the way they see things. But let's leave it there. You've got a busy day, and I
Yeah.
hope all goes well with where you're off to later.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks
Okay.
very much. Take care. Speak to you very soon.
All right. Thank you. Bye bye.